The major question that I've explored in my 12 books has been the great mystery of what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. And it's something I think that most of us would agree is the greatest question you can possibly imagine. The one thing we know with inevitability is our own mortality. And since I was a very young child, this has intrigued me. Now, I came to the conclusion many years ago that really there are only effectively 3 options in terms of what happens when we die. The first option is the materialist reductionist scientific point of view, that when you die, that's it. You're gone, you're dead. So in other words, for, 13.8 billion years, nothing existed. Then for an infinitesimally small amount of time, something was consciously aware of something and disappeared. That's it, that's the end. That was you, that's all you ever were. You were a link in a genetic chain, a piece of sentient DNA. Of course, the problem with that is it means that morality suddenly goes out the window, doesn't it? Because what's the point of doing any good in your life? It's total nihilism, the idea that there is no point to anything. So you might as well live your life in a hedonistic swathe of just drinking and whatever you wish to do, and not necessarily looking after your fellow human beings or anything, because that's just the way it is. And that's the way with every single sentient being that's ever existed. And of course, if you take the viewpoint of the eliminative reductionists, people like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands, you're not even sentient anyway. You're fooling yourself into thinking you're sentient. How you can fool something that's unconscious, I have absolutely no idea, but this is what the eliminative materialists will argue. So, is there another alternative? Well, of course, there's the standard religious Judeo-Christian worldview, and that is when you die, you go to heaven or hell. So let's think about this for a second. Again, we have the same scenario of this sentient something that existed for an infinitely small amount of time, has one life, and in that one life, it has to get it right in the eyes of a deity that uncannily seems to reflect the culture that that deity is within, which in itself is strange, but you have to appease that deity with whatever arbitrary rules that religion tells you you should be. And by failing to do that, you are condemned to eternal hellfire, or all eternity in heaven. And then the question we have then is, well, what do we really mean by eternity? People use that term. And I came across a wonderful definition many years ago, used by Ram Dass. And he turned around and he said, imagine a scenario that there is a solid block of iron, and it's 3 miles high and 3 miles wide. And every 100 years, a bird flies along with a piece of the finest silk in its beak, and it brushes along the top. When that iron block has been worn down to nothing, is the first second of the first minute of the first hour of eternity. And that's what you need to think about. So you're going to be all eternity. Now, if you look at the general Christian viewpoint, if you are a good person, you go to heaven. And what do? You spend the whole of eternity singing the praises of God, basking within God's presence. Well, I don't know about you, but I'd find that a bit boring after about an hour or two. But on top of that, you're in a scenario whereby all the people you've ever loved in your world, maybe somewhere there, but if they are, can you find them? Will you know them? Will you recognise them? Because everybody's in spirit. If they are in heaven, are they in heaven as children? If a child dies, does a child grow up in heaven and becomes 25 or 30 years of age? I remember many years ago reading a wonderful book called Riverworld by Philip Jose Farmer, and in that everybody that had ever lived was reborn on a planet with a river that ran down from one pole to the other. And in that planet was everybody that had ever lived in different sections of the planet. And that's a similar idea to the concept of heaven, isn't it? But what are you going to do with your time in this heaven? You're in spirit, so will you ever taste food again? Will you ever drink again? You know, these are the things you have to think about when it really comes down to the idea of, is there an all eternity? Then we have the third option, which is reincarnation. And the idea that I've always found very, very intellectually interesting of the three. But even when you start to think about reincarnation, we start to have some issues. The practical issues are, for example, reincarnation is popular across many, many cultures across the world. It's a known fact, it's something that from the Tlingit Indians or the Tlingit Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest to across India, to Buddhism, Vedanta, everything. But they're all subtly different in what they mean by reincarnation. For example, the Tlingit Indians, Tlingit Native Americans, or First Nations, believe that you're reborn somewhere quite local to you, to where you die, and probably fairly immediately. But other cultures have different ideas. They say that you're reborn 6 months later, somewhere else. Then you have the argument, though, that within the caste system, you are reborn as anything. You could be reborn as a microbe or something. So the question then is, who makes that decision as to where you're going to be reborn? Is there somebody that has a huge ledger and decides that Joe Smith has got to be reborn in some society in a lower or higher caste? So the question here is, and then you have the problem, and it's not quite as bad a problem as the Judeo-Christian model, but the idea, and I'll come back to that, is that if you only have one life, you're judged on your behaviours on that one life. You don't have to get a second chance. If you get it wrong first time and you do something evil, that's it, you're out. You don't have the chance to learn from your mistakes. And to a degree it is similar with reincarnation, because the general model of reincarnation is that you're reborn but you don't remember the fact that you've been reborn. You don't know that you've lived before. And the vast majority of people in Occidental societies don't have any concept of previous lives because they're not socially programmed to have that. It's only in societies that have reincarnation that people necessarily believe in reincarnation. But the problem and the issue there is that you are reborn as somebody completely and utterly different. You're not reborn as yourself. You're reborn as somebody else with no remembrance of your previous life. Now let's think about this for a second. So if I'm reborn as somebody else, and I find that I'm in, say, a lower caste, or at a lower life form or whatever, how do I know what I did in my past life, whether I'm being punished or not? Surely the whole point of punishment is for you to realise that you did something wrong and to get it right this time. But for the vast majority of us, we don't have that. We don't remember our past lives, so how can we possibly know what we did last time? And of course the argument is, the last time, you weren't you. You were somebody completely and utterly different. So there is no link between you and your previous incarnation. And again, the question is, where do you go between lives? Now some people turn around and say that you sit down with somebody and decide on who you're going to be reborn as. Well, you may, but you may not. So the question really here is, what is really happening in terms of this life? Now I'm reminded here of the writings of the great German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger had this concept of Dasein, which is being there. Do you remember that great movie with Peter Sellers, Being There? And that was just fantastic. And being there is the concept that wherever you are there. So all you've ever known is you are you, looking out of your eyes, and you're perceiving the world, other than you're here. And as he argued as well, he had another concept called Geworfenheit, which is literally German for thrown in. The idea that we don't choose to be born, we just happen to find ourselves in this body, in this existence. And we are judged by that life. And then if we're reincarnated, we are judged again each and every life. So then the question is there alternatives? Well, in my writings, I suggest that there are alternatives. And I think we're misunderstanding how consciousness works. We're misunderstanding how consciousness can transfer from one consciousness to another. And of course, if we exist in a field of consciousness, then we effectively are embodied for a period of time, and then we're disembodied again. And again, quantum mechanics is very much telling us that this is the actual state of reality, that everything is effectively a singularity. And we're existing within a sea of consciousness, that we are almost like radios tuning into this sea of consciousness. But that needs more explanation than that. And I would suggest that there is another alternative which takes that argument to its logical conclusion using science. And I call this particular argument Cheating the Ferryman. And I first posited and suggested the model way back in 1999-2000. My first book came out in 2006 explaining this. And this new book is all the things I have learned from dealing with academics and talking to people since 2006 in terms of refining the model in the best way I can. So what do I mean by cheating the ferryman? Well, I can tell it by the most amazing event of my life. And it took place over 2 dates, around about 10 years apart. And the first one was way back in December 1993. And I was living in Colchester in Essex. And I was shopping for Christmas presents. And I went into a record shop, HMV, and I bought an album by a lady called Mary Chapin Carpenter. And going with the album, the record label had also brought out for 50p, you could get a CD of a selection of tracks that were to do with the new artists that were coming out. So I took it home that evening, and I played the Mary Chapin Carpenter, and then I put on the free CD. And I got to track 4. And it was the most extraordinary experience in my life. I knew that song. I knew that song with absolute assuredness. I knew the lyrics before I heard them. And it was sung by an American singer-songwriter called Sean Colvin. And the song was called A Round of Blues, from her album Fat City. The song was quite upbeat. It had a very interesting beat. It's a very, very nice song, and the video that you can see on YouTube is really, really good in terms of Sean Colvin. For some reason, I called my then partner into the room, and I said, Jen, can we go into our solicitors over the weekend, next weekend? I want my will changed. And she said, why? And I said, because I want this record played at my funeral. And she looked at me as she used to look at me, as completely mad. And I said, no, I want this at my funeral. This is my funeral song. So, you know, we went and we changed my will. Roll forward many years, 10 years. I still remember that incident, and that song was in my record collection. Now, I had meant to bring along both the CD so you could see it, and also the next bit I'm going to explain is, I'm a huge music fan. Massive. I just listen to music continually. And at that stage I had something called an Arcos AV400 MP3 player. And on that I had 16,000 separate MP3s. And at that time I was a divisional human resources manager for a group of hospitals. And I was continually travelling around the north of England, troubleshooting basically. And I always had it on random play. So any one track, 1 in 16,000 chance of a track coming up. So there I am, I'm driving. It is a cold, wintry evening along the M62, if anybody knows the M62, which links Lancashire to Yorkshire. And I'm driving along, positioning from where I was living at the time in Harrogate, and I was positioning to our Chester Hospital for a meeting the next day. As I was coming down towards Milne Row, as you're coming down off the top, the highest point of the motorway, and you're coming down through the Pennines, and you're coming down towards Manchester. I'm coming down, and the mists are coming down, and it's cold and everything. I kept being reminded. I was expecting the sign of the slaughtered lamb to appear in the hill and the side, you know, in terms of American Werewolf. And as I was driving along, suddenly, random play, Round of Blues comes on. And it immediately hit me, and I thought, that's never, ever played. Ever. Suddenly, my left arm grabbed, without my volition, grabbed the steering wheel and pulled it down. Now, as I was driving a very sporty RX-8, Mazda RX-8. That is irrelevant, it was just a beautiful car. But anyway, driving along, and I grab it, and I'd swerve into the inside lane. As I swerved into the inside lane, in front of me was a lorry, and on the back of the lorry was a load of crash barriers. The crash barriers came off the back of the lorry and bounced in the road. Had I stayed in that position, I would have been killed. There is no question about it. It would have hit my car, I'd have spun off, and I'd have been killed. I sat and waited for a few seconds shaking, and then I suddenly thought to myself, my God, I now know why that song I see as my death song. It was the last thing I heard before I died last time. And myself, living my life again, I recognised it earlier. Okay? Now that was the most stunning thing ever. Now, what is particularly interesting here is the lyrics of the song. The first section says, "We had our bitter cheer and sweet sorrow. We lost a lot today, but we'll get it back tomorrow. On a lost highway, I was on the M62 in fog. I hear the sound of wheels. That's what I heard, the squealing of this guy's car in front of me. I know the rainbow's end. Death." That stunned me. Now, at that time, I'd already come up with the concept of cheating the ferryman. And this to me reinforced the idea of what cheating the ferryman is. Now, in Cheating the Ferryman, what I suggest is, and in the book I do all the science of this. People who know my books know that I don't just make statements. I follow the Marcello Trui argument, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And everything I say in that book is referenced back to academic papers or to people's experiences. Now, I turn around to you now, and as a quick straw poll, how many of you have experienced déjà vu? Okay. How many of you experience déjà vu that you know what's going to happen next? How can that be? How can that be? If the future doesn't exist, how can you perceive the future? There has to be a scientific reason for that. On top of that, some people experience precognitions, general precognitions. If the future is already out there to be perceived, that's not surprising, because what you're doing is you're remembering. Déjà vu is not the correct term. It should be déjà vécu, already lived. And this is profoundly important. And in Cheating the Ferryman, this is exactly what I suggest. Is that, and without going into great detail in the science, I'll give one example of where the science comes from here. Stephen Hawking, 9 months before he died, wrote a paper with Thomas Hertog of CERN. And in this paper he put forward something he called the ringing telephone effect. He turned round and he said that from the first moment of the Big Bang, everything that can possibly happen was already encoded digitally within the universe. Every outcome of every action of every subatomic particle was already encoded in there. And what happens is, we all collapse the wave function in terms of, because subatomic particles, before they are observed or measured, are statistical waves. They have no existence until they are observed and measured, and that the wave function then collapses into a point particle. And that is done either by the act of measurement, or as many people argue, the act of observation by a conscious mind. So we are collapsing the wave function of our realities all the time. Now imagine a scenario that your reality is a CD, a super CD-ROM, of everything you can ever experience in your life. Every single outcome of every decision is already encoded in there. Now imagine a scenario that when you die, something strange happens with time. Now again, has anybody had the experience of getting bad news, falling around, being in a car crash where time just goes zzz? Okay? Incredibly common. Has anybody also heard of something called a panoramic life review within near-death experiences? Yeah. I saw my life flash before my eyes. It's one of the Moody traits, it's one of the Grayson traits within NDEs. What does that mean? What is that telling us? It's telling us that at the point of death, something curious happens in the brain. Now, for years I've argued this, and only recently there have been two phenomenal discoveries that have taken place. that everybody should know about, but they don't. And they vindicate my hypothesis absolutely to the T. The first thing was the research of a lady called Jimo Borgigin at the University of Michigan, where they did research on dying rats. And they found that when a rat starts to die, the mammalian brain starts to die, there is a massive, massive amount of brain activity. The brain suddenly seems to become one unit. It lights up everywhere, as if something is going on in the brain when the brain is dying. This was intriguing. But in 2022, something very curious happened in, I think it was in Germany. And there was an 85-year-old man who'd had injured himself. And he was in an MRI scanner. And he had a heart attack and he died. For the first time, they were able to record the brain activity of a dying person. They were stunned to discover that there was massive amounts of brain activity. Suddenly the brain was acting non-locally. It was communicating, it was firing everywhere. And as they said in the articles, in the academic articles, this seems to be evidence of the panoramic life review. That at the point of death, you seem to suddenly, all the activity happens. Now, what I would suggest is that this activity happens from your point of view, the dying person, in a completely different form of time to the time of the observers that's watching somebody die. Imagine a scenario, you're dying, and we were talking before, you're in a car crash, time expands outwards. Imagine a scenario when you're dying. You're in massive stress. Time expands outwards. But time could expand out for a massive amount. Because time is the only thing I know. I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time a few years ago. Time is the only thing that we measure by itself. You can have a minute of a minute, an hour of an hour. But it's all subjective perception. So your final second of your life could be a year, a month, 75 years. So what do you fill that time with? Your panoramic life review, running in real time, one-to-one real time. But then the difference is, you're not alone in that second time round. I argue that there's something, an entity I call the daemon, which others you will call either your higher self, your spirit guide, whatever you want to call it. That is also the entity that in near-death experiences people call the being of light. You know, people turn around and say, when I died I saw my grandfather, I saw Jesus, I saw Elvis Presley. Children see schoolmates, people who are still alive. So whatever this entity is, it's not what it's claiming to be. That's your own higher self. At the point of death, we split into two entities. The lower everyday self that lives one life I call the eidolon, and the higher self I call the daemon. The daemon is that voice in your head. I'll guarantee most of you have had that. You meet somebody, a little voice goes, this person's wrong, this person's dangerous. The time when you're driving along a road and suddenly you come out of the road and a car comes past. In the book I give many examples of people who do this, including top scientists. I give an example of Max Tegmark, one of the world's leading quantum physicists, who had an event take place when he was cycling through the back streets of Copenhagen when he was a schoolboy. And he's cycling along and suddenly something made him put the brakes on as a lorry trundled past. He was so fascinated by this, he set up a model, and again, just check it out. Just go online tonight when you get home and put up quantum suicide. What Tegmark does is he does something similar to myself. He turns around and he says, you can take quantum physics and you can prove by quantum physics that we're all immortal. That we never die. Versions of us die, but not the version that's you. You will always survive because you're your observer in your own reality. So what really is happening here is that imagine the daemon, life is a three-dimensional digital computer game. And again, I do the physics of this. I take you through from black holes to information theory within black holes, to how black holes process information, the way information is now found to have physical presence, and the way in which this is a hologram. And within the hologram is the outcome, as I said, of every decision. So imagine your life is like a third-person computer game. The game starts, you're born. First time you live, you don't have a daemon, so you just wander aimlessly through your life. But the second time, your daemon becomes aware of itself. It's your game player. When you're playing a computer game, you know, you have the scenario, Lara Croft from my generation, she goes down a corridor, runs into a room, there's a big monster and she gets killed. Lara Croft, the on-screen sprite, is dead. However, the game player isn't. And the game player now has a bit of knowledge of how that life's going to go out. So it starts again. And do you remember when you play these games, what you do is you know not to go in that room. Or you know to pick up the weapons, or you know what to do. That's the daemon. The daemon guides you through your life. And in doing so, it does it over multiple lives. As the Russian translation of my first book, they called it Groundhog Life. And in many ways, it's quite similar to Groundhog Day. In Groundhog Day, Connors, the character Connors, the TV weatherman, he's a daemon that's aware that he's living within an hedonic lifestyle. And what does he do? He manipulates the world to his advantage. Each day, he moves on and he does things. This is what I believe is happening in our lives. We live multiple lives, and every one is different depending upon the decisions you make. And your daemon is living an adventure. It's living your life, and it will say, well, this time round I'll marry her, or this time round I'll go and live in Australia and see what happens. And it will follow all of those patterns. Can you now see how déjà vu works? Déjà vu works because you've remembered you've done this before. People turn around to me and say, déjà vu is proof of reincarnation. No, it's not. And I'll give you one damn good reason why it's not. If I have a déjà vu now, I'm not standing here. I'm looking at all of you. The déjà vu involves all of you at Watkins in February of 2023. I'm not seeing you dressed as ancient Egyptians or Victorian people. I'm perceiving this as it is now, through my eyes and through my body. So your déjà vu is literally a remembering of something you've done in your past. And that is in fact the definition of déjà vu by, what's his name? There's a psychiatrist in Seattle. I think his name will come to me in a second. But the idea is that it's the remembrance of something that's happened at an indeterminate time in your past. So when people say, I'm remembering a déjà vu, that's not the point. The point of déjà vu is you're not remembering it. That's the confusion. You're getting images of something. So that shows that. It also proves how precognition can work, can't it? Because if we've lived this before, this is why we precognize things. But then it gets more complex and the developing model is that we have the daemon, which is your game player. And I don't do the science of this because it's more hypothetical, but I then argue, and it's more Jungian in terms of this, that I have a concept above that which I call the Uberdaemon of everybody. It's the Jungian collective unconscious, for want of a better term. And what that means is that under certain circumstances we can access the memories of all humanity. And this is what happens when people regress. When you have a hypnotic regression and you go back into a past life. You're not going back into a past life, you're twigging into memories that are available to you in your hypnotic state. So I then argue that above that is something I call the Godemon. And the Godemon is something that people who are interested in Vedanta and various Eastern belief systems will understand as being the overself. It will be the Or Ein Sof. Within the Kabbalah, it will be the concept of Brahman. The idea of the consciousness of everything. And we are like distilled down from the consciousness of everything, which is God, effectively, down into the humanity bit, which is the Uberdaemon, into individual daemons. Which means effectively we are, as Bill Hicks said, one singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. And we are living within a brain-created, or it's more complex than that, but this is really kind of a collective hallucination. It's a program, it's digital. For instance, there's a guy called Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in Canada. They're looking for the pixelation of space. They're actually looking for the pixelation. This holographic principle is not woo-woo science, it's serious stuff. And it's being used to explain certain anomalies within cosmology, which I talk about in the book. So finally, What do I mean when I use the term cheating the ferryman? Ancient Greek times, when somebody died, what would happen was they would be laid to rest, and coins, 2 coins or 1 coin, would be placed over the eyes, the oboli. Or they'd be placed, or a single coin would be placed underneath the tongue of the corpse. The reason that was done was that when the person died and moved on, they were a shade, and they'd find themselves at the banks of the river Styx, or the Acheron, and it's all misty, and through the mist comes Charon the boatman. And the person then would take the coins off their eyes or out their mouth to pay Charon the passage to cross over to the underworld. I argue you cheat the ferryman. You never pay him the amount of money, because you never get to the point of death. Because the major objection to every hypothesis about life after death and human immortality falls upon one great problem. There's no brain processing the person. If you're dead, you're dead. If your brain is dead, there's no brain activity. Do I necessarily believe that? No, I don't. But the scientists will argue that. They can't argue that with cheating the ferryman, because it's happening in a live brain. Remember I said, it happens in the split second before you die. So your brain is still active. What's happened is, what everybody has missed in this is time. Because time is subjective, everybody thinks, oh, you die in time. Yes, you see other people die in your time. But within that person's time, they've already fallen out of time. And again, I do the maths of this. In the first book, I have a concept called Thomson's lamp, which is how bisection works. You know, it's like Zeno's paradox and the idea of smaller and smaller bits of time. So you're already out of time. And you're existing in smaller, smaller pieces of time. And of course, the big, massive, fascinating thing is that time and space are the same thing. Time becomes space, and space becomes time. This is pure Einsteinian physics. So in which case, when we think there's space out there and time is here, they're both the same thing. So there's a deeper level of reality. And our science is starting to discover this now. The physics is starting to become more and more fascinating, and the discoveries are extraordinary. I'll leave you with one other thing. Last year, the winners of the Nobel Prize for Physics, does anybody know who won the Nobel Prize for Physics last year? I guarantee you won't, because the press don't want to talk about this. The winners was a guy called Alain Aspect and a guy called Anton Zeilinger. Alain Aspect works at the University of Paris Division of Optics, and Zeilinger is Professor of Physics at the University of, I think, either Vienna or Innsbruck. These two guys won it for discovering something called non-locality. Discovering that if you take 2 subatomic particles and you entangle them, that is, put them in the same state, and then you move them any distance, there's instantaneous communication between them. Instantaneous. Which effectively means that when we talk about space, it's not there. Because if you think about it, how can 2 things, particles, a vast distance apart, communicate instantaneously? The fastest possible speed is 186,000 miles a second. But these are communicating instantaneously. Non-locality is the really big thing at the moment. This is the basis of quantum computing. And non-locality and elements of this is also why the sun shines, which you don't tend to find in books on science, but it is. There's something happening in the sun which is to do with quantum mechanics and quantum physics. We are on the first steps of understanding what this is. And our science is great, and it's got so far. But we've got an awful long way to go. And I think the paradigm is starting to change. And the young scientists are coming up and thinking through the implications of the discoveries of quantum mechanics. And now, quantum neurology and quantum biology. Because it's now discovered that quantum effects are involved. Even photosynthesis is a quantum effect. Right, thank you.
I say, yeah, from what you said about the reincarnation idea, classic reincarnation, people being Egyptians and things like that, I don't think it is mutually exclusive with your ideas. It would only be if this recurrence of lifetimes that we experience is infinite. And I think maybe rather like the Phil character in Groundhog Day, we do eventually wake up and it is the next day.
Yes, I mean that's a very, very good point, because the argument is, of course, the amount of lives is not finite. And again, in the book I discuss that you can't divide ultimately time forever, because you can't do it. It doesn't work mathematically. So clearly there must be a point, and I'd like to believe that what happens is, in those instant final few seconds, like Connors does, you ultimately live the perfect life. You ultimately play the perfect game, and then you move on to whatever is next, and whatever is next could be whatever your religious beliefs are or whatever, because it's still your universe which you're creating. Yep.
Obviously it's a big question that you're approaching, and other people have also tried to approach it in different ways. What's your take on someone like Michael Newton's theory, where time isn't as linear as we perceive it to be? It's not just a chronological thing, it's layered and it can be reviewed and switched around. What's your take on other people's theories like that?
Absolutely. I mean, all Michael Newton there is taking, actually, funnily enough, J.W. Dunn's Serial Time. And I don't know whether he necessarily cites his sources. No, he doesn't. A lot of them don't.
Apparently getting from the chemotherapy sessions.
Yeah. The idea of J.W. Dunn in his 1929 book, An Experiment with Time, argued serial time, that there are different times. And it's a very logical way he makes this. He turns around and he says, if time is a river and a river is flowing, how do I know a river is flowing? The only way you know a flow is taking place because of the riverbanks. You see the riverbanks and the river is flowing. If you take the riverbanks away, you can't see the flow. So he argued, so in order for us to have the time flow, there must be another time behind that time that gauges the time. And of course that ends up as an infinite regress. But he also argued that we also have observer 1 in one time and then observer 2 in another time. And I'd argue observer 1 and observer 2 are exactly the same as my Damon and Ada one. Yes, Michael Newton's stuff is good and it's interesting, but I would like to believe, and I stand corrected on this, that I'm the only one of the writers, and I mean the only one, that's actually supporting this with actual science, rather than saying, oh, somebody said they were hypnotised and they went back and they did this and this. That's fascinating. But it's not evidence as far as the scientific community is concerned. You've got to go back and you've got to say, this is why I'm coming to these conclusions, and this is the information I'm basing it upon.
Do you think that the idea of quantum entanglement between two particles with the instantaneous communication and connection could be what is meant by, could occur between individuals, and is what is meant by the silver thread that can connect two people, and the idea that someone could be you're meant to meet certain people, and that you can communicate even if you've not seen that person for a long time, you still feel that kind of intuitively feel a connection between them.
I use the analogy here of entanglement is when subatomic particles share the same quantum state. 13.7 billion years ago, everything was a point particle, and the universe came out of an infinitesimal point particle, which was the Big Bang, which wasn't big and wasn't a bang. And it just appeared from nowhere. Now, if that meant that every single subatomic particle that now makes up the universe, every single photon, muon, quark, was all entangled within a small area, it means everything is entangled. Every single thing, every single particle in the universe relates to every other single particle in the universe. And again, coming back to the point, I'm very much in the feeling of people like Ernest Mach, the German scientist, who argued that space needs things in it. Space itself is an illusion. Space is nothing. And I think that's where we get it wrong. We have this idea of distance between things. There is no distance between things. We are all one unity. And again, repeating Bill Hicks, we are one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, which means when we meet certain people, we resonate with them. We resonate with them either because we remember them from past lives, or there is just something there. Yeah. And I genuinely believe that.
So do I.
Now, I can't necessarily prove it, but I genuinely believe in here.
Yes, so do
it's
I.
a heart feeling.
Yeah.
Yes, Jade.
You wrote a book about out-of-body experiences. How do you think that experience fits in with a lot of what you've spoken about, given quantum consciousness?
Absolutely accurately. I work with a lot of people that have out-of-body experiences, such as yourself and various other people in the audience. And I believe that the out-of-body experience, and lucid dreaming and other non-normal states of consciousness are profound clues to this model. And it again shows that there is a reality behind this reality. There are nested realities that we exist within that we can, under certain circumstances, travel within these realities. And I know from my own experience, my own precognitive dreaming, my own lucid dreams, I know that there is another reality we go to that is just as real as this. In fact, probably realer, because the people I know that have experienced these places come back here and think, this is the facsimile. This is the illusion of the places you go to.
What's your take on Robert Temple? We are plasma universe and plasma being.
Very much so. This is, again, I'm talking about another book here, but my 2019 book, which I also launched here, called The Hidden Universe, that's the conclusion I draw there, that entities, which I call egregores, are effectively plasma beings, and that plasma is where probably other sentients exist. And I'm particularly interested, for instance, the thing that really intrigued me was on reading sections of the Quran where it turns around and says that man, I think, was made of mud, and the angels were made of light, and the jinn were made of smokeless fire. And smokeless fire is plasma. So, and there's a friend of mine called Brian Eno, not Brian Eno, he used to use Roxy Music, Paul Eno. They are related, by the way. Paul Eno is an American, and he's been researching entities for many, many years. And he said the amount of times he's seen entities manifesting around electrical substations and everything else as if they're drawing the plasma from the electricity. And I believe that's what's taking place. I also believe that these entities, we are co-creating them, but effectively they use us to come into this existence as well, if that makes sense. But you'd have to read my book to get the full argument of that. There's a gentleman over there.
On those subjects, what's your take on psychedelic substances? Do you interview anyone in the book about that?
Not necessarily in that book, but I wrote a book called Opening the Doors of Perception, where I discuss in great detail the effects of DMT. DMT, 5-MeO DMT, ayahuasca, the role of the pineal gland, the role of endogenous DMT, probably synthesized from melatonin within the pineal gland. So no, I do that. Most of the issues building up to this book have been dealt with in previous books in detail. And I have a number of friends, and there's a number of people in the audience now, who are researching directly the role of DMT within the brain. And I'm delighted that they're there, they know who they are. So that's my opinion on that. Yes, it's profoundly important.
Final question. Hi, me? Sorry. If I recall correctly, I read recently a couple of books by the idealist philosopher Bernardo Castro, who cites with references some of your work. And I know at the moment he's gradually knocking down materialist scientists
very effectively.
Like no one's business. Do you see your ideas as consistent with idealism, or anchored in material world, or somewhere between?
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw an article only a couple of days ago, and I posted it on my Facebook page, and it was an introduction to an article written by David Chalmers, the guy that came up with the hard problem. And Chalmers is arguing that, you know, as you go through your career as a neurologist and a philosopher, you start as a reductionist materialist, and you work your way through, and you end up being an idealist, because that's the information it tells you. And I think that there's no warfare going on here between materialism. The answers are there, but I think Kastrop is doing a fantastic job in doing the philosophy and the science of these ideas, and I think it's profoundly important. We all know, every single person in this room knows that there's something in your head that is thinking, that is individual, that is non-physical. You know, you're not an epiphenomenon of your brain functions, you know, the idea, and as I've argued in one of my books, where does consciousness come? Is it the addition of one molecule within the brain, one quark, as it becomes more complex? Because there's the argument, isn't it? It's the argument from complexity, that, you know, things become so complex that they become an epiphenomenon. It just comes out of, like water and wetness comes out of oxygen and hydrogen. And it's the same thing, that consciousness just spontaneously occurs. Well, from where? Where does it spontaneously occur from? You know, and they're the big questions.
For